Welcome to the Transformations Perspective, episode 7. Yeah, it's another day late, but being a teacher, you're quite busy all week long. But I'm glad you could join me for the 7th episode about immigration. I'm your host, Harper, and today's episode is called The History of Immigration Law in America. So, let's take a quick, brief look at what happened this week in the United States politics realm. You had the DNC take place this week in Chicago. You had Vice President Harris and Governor Walz accept the nomination for president and VP. They also had several keynote speakers, former presidents, former president candidates, and other non political figures that were giving big speeches. So here we are. Both conventions are done. It is now a sprint, I would say, not a race, a sprint to November 5th election. The next big thing on the docket is September 10th, where Harris and Trump will have their first debate. I think they have two scheduled, they said. Otherwise, I think Vance and Walz have one scheduled for October as well. So early voting begins in September in some states. So we're in the thick of it. Here we go. But let's continue to understand that second issue of immigration. United States. It's still a very hot topic, and today is all about history lesson referring to the immigration in the United States. Yep, it can be mundane at first, but bear with me, please. You got to understand the pretext before we get to why there's so much immigration coming at the southern border. So let's look at the overall arcing aspect of immigration. Colonialism is a type of immigration. The British, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, all these European powers, Spanish, Portuguese as well, these European powers during the early 1500s were trying to expand their empires. So you get this concept of basically trying to get to the West Indies through a different route instead of going around Africa. Now you end up landing in the Americas that they didn't know existed, which was inhabited by the indigenous people of the Americas. So then we start bringing more and more people over to the Americas, which are immigrants settling the Americas, which think about how the indigenous people actually felt and still feel about how European ancestries were coming here to the Americas. Put that into context. So, British immigrants at first, arriving here, 1776 arrives, which then we declare our independence here in the United States from Great Britain's rule. So this is where the context of immigration starts to unfold. Why immigrants want to come to America so bad? And it's very heavily rooted in the Declaration of Independence. If you ask immigrants their perception of the Declaration of Independence, or Americans' perception of the Declaration of Independence, or for the matter, if you're in my classroom and we learn about the Declaration of Independence and we compare Jefferson's rough draft to the original, the one that was published, and we see the contexts that are different that are there, we understand what the Declaration symbolizes for anyone outside America, or for that matter, enslaved people, women, indigenous people, all that. So here's some things. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote after the revision, his rough draft, right? Unquote, that all men are created equal. End quote there. Men referring to not the universal terminology maybe we know to today as like, well, mankind, referring to like men and women and everybody. This is not what the founding fathers or Jefferson were portraying. men referring to basically free white property men. Let me rephrase that. Free white males that owned property or had property. That was what men stood for in the Declaration of Independence. So the emphasis on men was meaning that basically the white men that owned property, which then that meant African slaves or African American slaves or freed African American slaves or women or indigenous people were not considered citizens of that time or part of the US, or for that matter, in that context of men, I should say. So we go on for our second quote when we look at the Declaration of Independence. On quote, the government are instituted among men, end quote. Once again, this is not a context of all what they say is humankind or mankind, of trying to use that universal term that they said back then. But still, once again, men referring to the white freed males that own property during that time period. Here's another one that's really good. This is where that perception comes from that immigrants have, Americans have. Unquote, certain unalienable rights, end quote. Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence originally with inherited and unalienable rights. Unalienable rights in the context is life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which was changed from John Locke's of property, which contradicts slavery, all that stuff. But anyway, the difference between inherent and certain. Inherent means you are born with them, right? You are born with these unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But if you now say certain, that means not everybody has those rights. But how it's interpreted is that means everybody. That means if you were an enslaved person back then, if you were a freed person, indentured service, you are a woman, you're an indigenous person, anybody in Europe, Asia, wherever you heard this context against Britain, you realize, you know what? Man, I want to get to America. I have this opportunity, a land of opportunity. I have rights versus these other countries that I'm living in. I don't have these rights. That is the perception. Certain unalienable rights is that perception that everyone has them. The founding fathers changed Jefferson's words of inherent, saying, no, not everybody, just your white males, free white males that own property have these rights. And then the battle begins for rights and civil liberties for the rest of it. That's a whole different topic I can talk about. So if you look at that aspect, this is where immigration idea, like, I need to come to America because this is really, really important. So let's look at some laws enacted by Congress, which had major impacts on immigration to the U.S. And these sources are coming from the passage of immigration law. This is where I got most of my research for this episode. So we're going to start with the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was passed on March 4th of 1790. Mind you, we just ratified the Constitution in 1789. So now we need to define what citizenship looks like in the United States. So it's criteria for foreign-born individuals to become U.S. citizens. So it's permitted free white males, again, free white males, not women, not enslaved, not indentured servants, not people of different descents of racial backgrounds, freed white males that were good character and had 2 years of residency in the U.S., they could become citizens. Okay. Next, you have citizens' children born outside the U.S. were considered natural born citizens. We still have that in place today. And Naturalization Act of 79 effectively excluded people of African and Asian descent from becoming citizens. welcome to the So, what does this actually mean? That means that only white freed males had this opportunity for citizenship. Women were excluded. Freed African American slaves were excluded. Even indigenous people who have been here from the beginning are excluded from this. We speed up the process now. We almost move ahead 100 years before the next major immigration policy takes place. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is prohibiting Chinese immigrants from coming to the US for at least 10 years. It's a long time to wait for a visa to get here. We're going to get to that visas later on as well. So, this basically, Chinese Exclusion Act, I'll note that it was repealed in 1943. So, what this did was the Chinese immigrants were subjected to discriminatory and abusive treatment, including deportation and internment. Well, internment would be is putting in some kind of camp like we did the Japanese during World War II. Right? Oh, we need to exclude you. We don't want you part of society, kind of thing. We have never been kind and nice to most immigrant policies that we have coming here. You're going to see a couple that are nice. That refugee acts for immigration, but ultimately, like, man, we are vicious to anybody that was not considered member in the pretext of the Declaration of Independence and the Naturalization Act of 1790. If you aren't white male, we don't care. That's the context of the United States. So, what else do we need to know about this? What led? The big question I'm going to ask, the inquiry question I'm asking is, what led to the Chinese Inclusion Act? Because there has to be pretext to this, right? There just has to be. So, let's look at some context to the Chinese Inclusion Act. It starts with the Transcontinental Railroad. Wow. We got to go back a little bit. We actually got to go back to the 1840s. So almost 40 years prior to understand. So hopefully I'm pronouncing this name right. Asa Whitney, a New York merchant active in China trade. Wow. Surprise, surprise, right? A merchant who's invested into economic benefits of trade with China gets the ball rolling for the proposal of the Transcontinental Railroad. Think about it, it's easier to get to China from the West Coast than it is to go all the way around South America to get there. So you get this proposal. Asa suggested the use of Irish and German immigrants because there's an abundance of them. Heck, they're flooded here. Let's use these immigrants. Let's put them into this labor that's going to benefit America. Immigrants coming over here, we're going to put them to work to make transcontinental rail so we can connect America, expand Western expansion, and move goods and services. This is going to be great. And later, the Chinese were also included in this, and actually was majority of the immigrants working on the Transcontinental Railroad were Chinese immigrants. So the Chinese immigrants worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, also worked in mines, and also worked in factories to basically help build up America. But yet then we turn on these immigrants, say, no, we don't like them, even though they helped build America. So what are the push and pull factors that actually brought the Chinese here? Remember last week's episode, we talked about the push and pull factors of immigration from other countries. So the push factor that brought Chinese immigrants to America in the 1850s was to escape economic chaos in China. Kind of fits the theme of what I talked about last week in last week's episode as well, right? The pull factor, the gold rush in California. That is the major pull factor. That was everybody's pull factor. Even people on the East Coast of the United States at the time, that was a major pull factor. Like, I'm going west, I want to get rich, kind of thing. That's the pull factor. Even other countries, word does spread. Even though word spread slowly back then, it still spread and people wanted to get rich. Gold was the thing. So back to this railroad proposal. Finally, after 15, 17 years of dealing with Congress, yes, should we do it? Not should we do it? Finally, the Railroad Act of 1862 goes into place. And then 7 years later, May 10th, 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and mainly through German, Irish, and a heavy amount of Chinese immigrants that completed the Transcontinental Railroad. So, then what led to this Chinese inclusion? If they help build America and connect coast to coast America, why are we trying to get rid of them? Let me explain. So here's my inquiry question. What caused the hostility towards Chinese American workers during the 1780s? Remember, the Chinese Inclusion Act was 1882. So it has to start prior to that. So the railroad's complete. Now we get this. Now we're angry at you, right? Economic and cultural tensions, as well as ethnic discriminations, were a primary cause of this. Okay. Yeah, there's recessions during this time period as well. This is, remember, coming out of post-Civil War, Reconstruction era. This kind of context, westward expansion is taking place in America. So what you have is Chinese immigrants were already working for lower wages than non-Chinese immigrants. But I guess you could say is like, what's worse in America than immigrants fighting immigrants for jobs and saying, well, I should get a better pay, but I'll work for less. It's almost like you're competing for less of a wage, so you get a job. So you're almost undercutting the other immigrant. So you get a job, so they don't have to pay the other immigrant. It's a battle back and forth kind of thing. So what happens is the non-Chinese workers began to resent the Chinese who might squeeze them out of a job. Think about it. If you have American business owners who are going to hire Chinese immigrants to work for less than other immigrants, then whose fault is it? But then we go back to that these other immigrants or other American citizens are lobbying to get rid of the Chinese because they want the jobs that are going to pay more. And are these businesses actually going to pay the American citizens more? See, this whole concept has been rooted so far back in American economic history that it's nothing new that why companies move overseas to pay workers a cheaper wage to make more money. Started here, right? So, the Chinese Inclusion Act set the precedent for later immigration restrictions on race and national origin. We've all heard this precedent when it comes to Supreme Court cases. That's exactly what that means. This establishes precedent for established, even if they're constitutional or unconstitutional aspects. I should say more unconstitutional. So the U.S. history has a long history of discrimination for non-white immigrants. Let's look at the slaves, right? From Africa are one of the largest imports of immigrants for labor in the U.S. 12.5 million slaves were brought from Africa between 1526 and 1867. Yes, mind you, slavery was outlawed in 1865, right? But we're talking all of America, so North and South America, right? 12.5 million immigrants are brought here. Say, hey, we want you for cheap, free labor. This is going to be great. And as soon as they're established as free, which air quote free is because that we know in the United States, we passed a lot of laws that went against them. You know, the Black Coat laws, Jim Crow era and stuff like that. They technically weren't really free aspect because they were persecuted. But that's another whole topic, another episode. So if we look at this, you've got the U.S. seems to be always using immigrants to build America. Or I'm going to steal this phrase from Donald Trump. to make America great, end quote. Yet immigration is the second biggest issue for Americans, that we want to make America great again. But you know what? America was great because we brought in immigrants to make it great. But now we want to stop that. Starts with slavery, everybody. That's where it started in our history, importing millions of slaves to build up our economy, to build up our country. So, where do we get to modern context from this? Understand our visa system that we've got. So, like our green card and visa system, I'm going to get to that next week. That's going to be my main focus for next week's episode. But we need to understand where that history came from as well. So, let's go through this quickly. So, what is the Immigration Act of 1924? This is where the context of visas and restricting the amount of immigrants coming to the United States. So literally 100 years ago, and plus a couple years because we had to go back during World War I, the pretext of that again. So once again, got to build for that moment. So 100 years ago, we enter in the mass restriction age of immigration in the United States. So the Immigration Act of 1924 established quotas for immigrants based on their country of origin. So we're limiting who can come here. Quotas provided visas to 2%, mind you, okay, to the total number of people of each nationality based on the 1890 U.S. Census. But hey, you know what? We're going to exclude Asians. Okay, it's 1924. Why the heck are we using 1890 census? Mind you, that's 34 years prior to this act. The U.S. Census had a census in 1920. Why are we using 34-year-old data? There's a reason for that. U.S. population is a lot less. We're excluding Chinese immigrants. There's maybe not as many because of the war. The Great War, as they called it, right? So, the concerns started over national security during World War II. Where have we heard that before? We hear it now. National security. Immigration is a crisis of national security. But I'm pretty sure it also was a big thing during 9/11, where it was a national security issue because any Arab American immigrant was a national security. We need to do something about it. Like I said, we do not have a very good history, or I should say positive image of our immigration laws in this country. So in 1917, this is during World War I, immigrants had to pass a literacy test in any language. If you could read, it didn't matter if it was English or not. Okay, we'll let you in. So it's like the first restriction. But also, on top of that, they created a higher tax paid by new immigrants coming here. On top of doing the literacy test, now they have to pay a higher tax for arrivals and allowed immigration officials. So this is the first establishment of officials tracking orders and stuff like that to exercise who's excluded. We're not doing that. But remember, the precedent is the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can do that. We also established in this pre-context during World War I is the Asiatic Barred Zone. That means all Asians except the Japanese and Filipinos were allowed in, but every other Asian was not. The reason for that is the Philippines was a U.S. colony. Of course, it's our colony, right? We got to be able to let them free flow. We need Americans going there. We need Filipinos going there. That's what we want. The Japanese, the deal was struck as a kind of a gentleman's agreement where Japan passed an immigration law saying we are going to limit the number of Japanese going to the United States. So this kind of helped the United States. So we said, we'll still allow Japanese to come here. So that was that context. And then what happens from there? You get Republican Senator from Vermont, William Dillingham introduced measures to limit immigration to 350,000 immigrants per year, which was a 3% of the 1910 census. So remember, this is during World War I, 1917. This is being passed. So 7 years prior to the Immigration Act of 1924. So we go back to the Immigration Act of 1924, right? This lowered the visas from 3% to 2%, as well as pushed back that census calculation back to 1890. Why? I don't understand that. I don't get it. Why go back 34 years? We're using 1910 data. I get census data. It takes a while to tabulate, but still, why? So also, we're looking at is the quota was based on a number of people born outside the U.S. or number of immigrants in the United States. This also changed the quota to trace origins of the whole in the U.S. populated include natural born citizens. And what that means is they focus more on British heritage. So saying going back to the 1700s, the 1600s, when British colonies say, hey, you know what? We had more of white people coming to the United States or the colonies because their ancestors were Britain. So we allow more of those people to come in, then we can keep our racial aspects where we want. So, Immigration Act of 1924 also included provisions excluding entry of any alien who, under race or nationality, was ineligible for citizenship. So now we're excluding any racial things. Remember, we're going back to the British ancestry as our primary focus to let immigration in. So white people to come here. Anyone else of diversity? No, we don't want them. This meant even Japanese were now excluded. Oh, this is not good. Prehistory lesson for World War II here is this is going to hurt the relationship with the United States and Japan, which then ultimately leads to Japan saying, you know what, if you're not going to trade with us and you're not going to let us have immigrants come here, we need to figure out our empire and expand for resources ourselves. So what do? That's exactly what we do. They go build an empire, they ally with Nazi Germany, rest is history, right? So the U.S. was more concerned with preserving the racial composition with nations to promote white people to come here than having diversity being promoted. We don't care about the relations with any other nation as long as we can keep the white population here. So the overarching goal, though, so this is how we define it. The overarching goal was to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity, it's a tough one to say, which is defined as the quality or the state of being all the same or all the same kind. Means no diversity. And once again, we could bring this back to the Declaration of all men, white men, free white men, right? And then certain unalienable rights, meaning free white men, right? We're referring back to this again, even though now women could vote and they're citizens and stuff like that, but we still want to keep that context. Let's rapid fire through the rest of immigration laws that we've got here. Quick fact here is the peak of U.S. foreign-born immigration or immigrants was at 14.8% of U.S. population, and that happened in 1890. That's where they're using that data from. All right. There was a drastic drop in foreign. After that, there was a drastic drop of foreign-born starting in 1910, which was at 14.7% foreign-born, to an all-time low in 1970 at 4.7% foreign-born. Why did it happen? Let's look at it. Labor shortage during the Civil War. We passed an Immigration Act of 1864, which encouraged immigration. So because labor is shortage, we want to bring in people to make sure our economy keeps going. Immigration Act of 1875 prohibited criminals and from immigrating in here. Okay. Also, if you hired an Asian worker, it was considered a felony under law. In 1891, Immigration Act is passed. It expanded the list of exclusions for immigrants who had contagious diseases and polygamy, which the contagious diseases thing goes back to Title 42 during the pandemic that Trump implemented. Immigration Act of 1903, it banned anarchists, beggars, importers, and prostitutes from coming to this country. The Barcelo Agreement of 1942. Oh, here's a good one again. Allowing Mexican immigrants to come to the United States as temporary agricultural workers during World War II because we were short workers because they were off fighting in the war. So Civil War, World War II, we bring in immigrants to make sure our economy stays strong. Interesting, huh? But here's the catch of that one, though. This is the good thing. In that agreement in 1942 is the U.S. had to pay the Mexican temporary immigrants U.S. wages equivalent to U.S.-born workers here. Also had to pay for the transportation. Also had to pay for their housing. Yeah, you don't see that now, that's for sure. Then in 1952, Immigration and Nationality Act. This removed the race and exclusion for immigration. Right, so no longer are we going to bar racial discrimination for immigrants. Also granted Asian countries to a minimum of a whopping quota of 100. 100 visas per year if you're an Asian immigrant. Also, exclusion for political activists, ideologies, and mental health, the preference for skilled immigrants, and family reunification. The Refugee Act of 1953. This gave 214,000 visas to refugees primarily from Europe to escape communist Soviet Union. You know, we didn't really have a good history after World War II with the communist Soviet Union, so let them come here. You know, take away people from them. So it's all a political maneuver. 1965 Immigration of Nationality Act is repealed the national origins quota system with 7 different categories of the preference system, emphasizing family reunification and skilled immigration. This basically creates 7 different visa categories. Like I said, I'm going to cover that next week's episode. In 1975, you have the Indochina Migration and Refugee Act. Basically, this is assisting Vietnamese and Cambodians who are fleeing South Vietnam, falling under North Vietnam communist reign. In 1980, you've got the Refugee Act of 1980, which created general admission for refugees and removal of the preference system. In 1986, Immigration Reform and Control Act. This is the first time we start targeting the southern border. Okay, so granted a pathway of permanent residencies for unauthorized immigrant workers who lived in the United States since 1982 or worked in certain agriculture jobs, which a lot of agriculture jobs were Mexican immigrants or Latin American immigrants working there. It also created the H-2A visas for temporary seasonal agricultural workers. But also, for the first time, increased border enforcement. In 1986 is the first time we start increasing border security. The reason for the mass increase of Mexican immigrants coming to the United States and why we have to have this is there was an economic crisis in Mexico. This is also a push factor, right? We talked about that in the last episode. Immigration Act of 1990 increased the annual immigration cap to 700,000 immigrants coming here. Creates the H-1B visa for highly skilled temporary workers. Also creates the H-2B visa for seasonal non-agricultural workers. And revised their grounds for exclusion and deportation of political, ideological ideas. This keeps going on. I'm almost there. Don't worry. Please bear with me. In 1996, Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act increased enforcement at the border, mandated the build the fences at the highest incidence areas in the southwest border and tighten emission for eligibility requirements and removal of criminals. So 10 years after 1986, where we start focusing on the southern border, we try to strengthen the border security by now starting to build fences. This is becoming an issue. So it's not just a 2023, 2022, 2024 whole pandemic issue. This has been going on for a while. The push factors. In 2002, the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act. This is an electronic database system for admission and removal of immigrants, otherwise known as the U.S. Visit. Also in 2002, after 9/11, is the Homeland Security Act. This is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, but I'm pretty sure in Project 2025, they want to get rid of the Department of Homeland Security, which I'm going to inform you right now is in charge of Customs and Border Protection, the CBP. Also, part of the Homeland Security Department is ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and also part of the Department of Homeland Security is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or the USCIS. All those funds are under the Department of Homeland Security, which I'm pretty sure under the Project 2025, if Trump gets elected, wants to get rid of. But they're trying to stop or control the borders. So doesn't that make the issue worse? Just a question. Last two here. 2006, the Deferred Action of Child Arrivals, otherwise known as the DACA. Young adults 15 to 30 who were brought here illegally as children without having a saying, basically they can apply for temporary deportation and relief, as well as a 2-year work permit. And then in 2014, deferred action for parents and Americans and lawful permanent residents. It's a long one. They just shortened it to the DAPA, and the DACA programs expanded. This is unauthorized immigrants and parents who live in the U.S. for at least 5 years and have children who are U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents to apply for deportation relief and a 3-year work permit. We also know then we fast forward to the Trump administration, which we're building the wall, tighter immigration, mass deportations. He wants more mass deportations. So the overarching grand scheme, I know it's a very long episode. I apologize. There's a lot of information for immigration. The concept is it starts under the precedent of the Declaration of Independence, where the idea is planted of certain unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that all these people created equal under God. This is where immigration ideas come, that they want to come to this country, even though that's not what that means in the Declaration of Independence, because we know it's just for white males that were free and owned property. There's a massive amount of information for the history of immigration, but it's really important to understand combining the push and pull factors that go along into immigration and on top of that history. So with that, thank you for watching. Get out and vote. It is so critical to vote, whether it's absentee, whether it's in-person voting. You got to get out and vote. Do not sit out the election and vote. You have that right to vote. Get out and vote. It's so, so critical. Once again, thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, share it, pass on the information. I know it's a lot, but I'm trying to inform different perspectives of why immigration and all these other topics about the election. See you next week. Bye.